Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel Future Force. It's compelling to consider how global actors respond when peace is shattered. And today we're focusing squarely on one such moment. The United States voicing concern at the United Nations over Russian attacks in Ukraine. In this extended exploration we'll examine everything through the lens of exterior, that is, global context and appearances, then dive deeply into the interior, exploring substance, performance, safety implications, and unique selling points of the U.S. reaction, before touching on costs, in the diplomatic, strategic, and humanitarian sense, then wrapping up with a conclusion. Let's begin by looking at the broader exterior context. The backdrop is a world stage where sovereign nations vie for influence, and where acts of aggression by one nation against another ripple across alliances, economies, and the very idea of international law. When the United States voices concern at the UN, it's not merely a diplomatic nicety, it's a signal to allies, adversaries, and neutrals alike that norms are under threat, and that the custodians of those norms are alert, engaged, and willing to speak up against that exterior backdrop. The U.S. statement carries weight. It's visible on television screens, in press briefings, in the chambers of the General Assembly and Security Council, and across the Times and the Post as headline, U.S. voices concern at UN over Russian attacks in Ukraine, a phrase that broadcasts urgency and condemnation. That exterior imagery matters, cameras panning on U.S. diplomats, delegations leaning forward, the gavel echoed to order the assembly, resolution language. These are the elements that shape public consciousness and signal to the Kremlin and to Kiev that the United States remains invested in conflict's outcome. Now let's take a long, deep dive into the interior, exploring the substance behind those public statements and the mechanisms, details, and texture of what occurred. This is the heart of our explanation, because what's compelling about international diplomacy isn't always what you see at first glimpse. It's the nuance behind the scenes, the plot beneath the headline, the layers beneath the soundbite. The United States statement at the UN isn't just words. It's the culmination of intelligence analysis, legal consultation, policymaker debate, and coordination with interagency teams. Officials likely studied incident reports from Ukraine, verified missile trajectories, shelling damage, civilian casualties, satellite imagery, then reference those with intelligence indicating Russian unit movements or chain of command and decisions. After establishing the facts, legal advisors assess whether the actions violate UN Charter articles, whether they constitute war crimes or crimes against humanity, whether there's precedent in prior Security Council resolutions. Simultaneously, the State Department consults allied capitals, London, Paris, Berlin, Ottawa, to coordinate messaging. Diplomats draft text that balances condemnation of aggression, calls for immediate cessation of attacks, demands for humanitarian corridors, while stopping short of over-escalation that might provoke direct confrontation. The drafting process is iterative. Versions circulated from New York to Washington, back to New York, with sub-ed. It's over phrases like barbaric bombardment versus unjustified attacks, civilians versus non-combatants, escalate sanctions versus consider further punitive measures. Meanwhile, national security teams weigh timing. Is this message better at a UN General Assembly or via a Security Council emergency meeting? Is there a UN Secretary General statement to dovetail with? Only when diplomatic language crystallizes, firm, fact-based, legally robust, synchronized with allies, does the spokesperson step to the lectern to deliver the line. The United States is gravely concerned by continued Russian attacks on Ukrainian cities and civilians. That sentence echoes with months or years of policy deliberation behind it. Interior also means understanding how that statement is received internally among U.S. agencies, defense, state, UZ, intelligence, and externally among audiences in Ukraine, Europe, Russia, and around the world. Ukrainian leaders likely note Washington's concern as both affirmation and signal affirmation that the principle of Ukrainian sovereignty still matters, and a signal that further escalation from Moscow may increase aid, sanctions, or intelligence sharing. European allies hear it and may feel bolstered to ramp up their own responses, diplomatic, material, or military. Russian foreign ministry statements may respond with defiance or counter-accusation, and state media domestically may downplay or spin the U.S. remarks as aggressive posturing, NATO expansion, or external interference. Ambassadors at the UN might engage behind closed doors to gauge whether there's consensus for further steps, perhaps drafting another resolution or calling for international criminal court attention. All of this is interior machinery, messaging, intention, alignment, legal standing, and real-world policy consequences. This paragraph captures that depth, and it's long to reflect the complexity. Turning now to performance, the dynamic of how those U.S. statements perform on the geopolitical stage. Performance covers not just the verbal content, but tone, timing, audience, and follow-through. At the UN, the performance is measured. Cum gravitas, disapproval of aggression, call for accountability. With the advantage of legitimate international forum, microphones, press galleries, photo ops. That performance demonstrates to allies and adversaries that the U.S. still leads, that it still has moral and diplomatic capital, and that it can still convene action. But performance is also post-speech action. Follow-up steps like coordinating further sanctions on Russian individuals, banks, energy sectors, shipping humanitarian aid to displaced Ukrainians, supplying defense systems or intelligence, activating European energy contingency, plans to reduce reliance on Russian oil and gas, pushing for investigation of war crimes, coordinating NATO reinforcement on eastern flank. Without those follow-throughs, the performance rings hollow, but with substance trailing words, performance becomes persuasive power. Next, let's move into safety features. In this context, that means mechanisms to protect civilians, de-escalate further violence, and uphold international law. When the U.S. voices concern, that signal contributes to safety features on multiple levels. First, there's legal safety, reaffirming that bombardment of civilian infrastructure is not only immoral but legally prohibited. Second, there's diplomatic safety, encouraging ceasefires, humanitarian corridors, and safe passage for civilians, journalists, aid workers. Third, strategic safety, conveying to Russia that continued escalation risks further cost, economic, reputational, strategic, thus serving as partial deterrent. Fourth, civilian protection, partnering with NGO and UN relief agencies to deliver food, medicine, shelter. These safety features are layered. The statement helps shape pressure on Russia to pause attacks, helps marshal resources to protect Ukrainians, enhances accountability, and preserves the possibility of negotiation. Even if those mechanisms don't instantly stop the bombs, they form part of a safety scaffold aiming to reduce harm. Turning to unique selling points, what makes the U.S. intervention at the UN uniquely valuable? First, there's moral authority rooted in long-standing UN membership, Security Council veto power, sadly, sometimes ironically undercut by the U.S. itself, but still signaling weight and diplomatic reach. Second, there's procedural expertise in crafting resolutions and navigating UN structures, knowing how to pace statements, sponsor resolutions, hold emergency sessions, build alliances among voting blocs. Third, there's resource capacity, U.S. diplomatic staff, financial contributions to UN peace and humanitarian funds, intelligence data, military aid, energy diplomacy. Fourth, there's narrative power, U.S. press coverage, global media narratives, soft power influence. Fifth, there's deterrent capacity, U.S. can threaten further sanctions, coordinate with G7 and EU, or underpin NATO posture. These features combine to make U.S. concern more than noise. It's a lever that mobilizes resources, tempers aggression, highlights norms, and pries open possibilities for relief and de-escalation. Now, what about price? Not price in dollars on paper, but price in political capital, economic cost, strategic risk, and reputational calculus. By speaking out, the U.S. risks escalating tensions, provoking retaliatory actions in cyberspace, energy blackmail, or proxy escalations in other theaters. There's domestic political cost, criticism for not doing enough or doing too much, burden shifting, polarization over foreign intervention. Economic cost includes costs of aid to Ukraine or sanctions that may feed inflation or energy price shock domestically and in allied states. Strategically, there's risk of entanglement, being seen as responsible for outcomes difficult to manage. What if fighting escalates beyond Ukrainian borders? Reputation-wise, the U.S. risks being depicted as meddlesome or inconsistent depending on future withdrawal or pivot elsewhere. So, the statement carries a price tag, serious consideration of consequences, balancing act between moral leadership and practical restraint. But the price is paid with conviction that sovereignty, human rights, and global stability matter. We now arrive at conclusion reflecting on all this tapestry. Exterior signal, interior substance, performance, safety, unique selling points, price. In conclusion, the U.S. voicing concern at the UN over Russian attacks in Ukraine is far more than rhetoric. It's an embodiment of what responsible power aims to do. Diagnose injustice, align allies, pressure aggressors, shield civilians, and preserve norms. The exterior appearance of solemn statements in the General Assembly is rooted in deep interior preparation, evidence gathering, legal framing, diplomatic drafting, allied coordination, that yields a performance on the world stage characterized by moral clarity and strategic calculation. It supports safety for vulnerable civilians and reinforces legal constraints. Its unique selling points, resources, leadership, narrative power make it effective, but it also exacts a price, political cost at home and abroad, economic strain, strategic risk. Yet, in choosing to speak out and to act, the United States, and by extension, the world community, stands on the side of sovereignty, of humanity, of rules that curb chaos. So the video reveals that even one UN statement can resonate across continents, mobilize action, and embody ideals. Thank you for joining this deep dive here on Future Force. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay hopeful.